What happens when three officers corner a decorated war hero on a quiet evening walk becomes a viral reckoning that exposes the truth about who really serves and protects. One man, one war dog, and a drone in the sky capture a moment that changes everything. This 72-year-old Medal of Honor recipient refused to back down, and what his military dog did next shocked the entire nation. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments, and if you love powerful stories of courage and justice, don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell. You won't want to miss what happens next. The California sun bled amber across Riverside's manicured lawns as Colonel Marcus Washington, retired, clipped the tactical leash to Sergeant's collar with hands that had once steadied under enemy fire. At 72, his spine still carried the rigid posture of a man who'd spent 4 decades in uniform. But tonight that familiar discipline felt different, watchful, wary, like the air before a storm that never quite breaks. Sergeant, a German shepherd with eyes sharp as broken glass, didn't just scan their surroundings. He calculated them. This wasn't a pet. This was a military working dog, trained in Afghanistan, retired with honors, and bonded to Marcus through shared understanding of what it meant to serve and survive. People saw an old man with his dog. Marcus knew better. They were 2 soldiers on patrol in a war zone that looked like suburbia. The evening walk had been their ritual for 3 years, ever since Martha's funeral, ever since the house grew too quiet and the walls seemed to press inward. The same route, down Magnolia Street, past the pristine lawns and silent Judgment, toward the park where eucalyptus trees whispered secrets to the wind. But for the past month, their ritual had gained an audience. The cruiser appeared first on a Tuesday, black and white, parked at the corner of Elm and 3rd, engine running, windows tinted dark as accusation. Marcus had noticed it immediately. 40 years of military training didn't just evaporate with retirement papers. By Thursday, it was there again. By the following Monday, he knew this wasn't coincidence. Officer Daniel Brooks sat behind the wheel, jaw set like concrete, eyes hidden behind mirrored aviators that reflected a world he'd decided was dangerous. Beside him, Officer Kevin Walsh drummed his fingers against his tactical vest, the kind of nervous energy that came from wanting action, any action, to justify the badge. In the back seat, Officer Tony Martinez, fresh from academy, still believing in honor, shifted uncomfortably, sensing something wrong but lacking the courage to name it. They watched Marcus like he was reconnaissance footage, analyzing every step, every pause, every moment. Sergeant's ears twitched. What they saw was a threat that didn't fit their narrative. A black man who walked with authority instead of apology, who wore his military bearing like armor they couldn't penetrate, who refused to shrink under their scrutiny. Marcus felt their eyes like crosshairs, but he didn't alter his route. Martha used to say, "You don't give ground to bullies, baby. You make them work for every inch." So he walked, spine straight, Sergeant at perfect heel, each step a quiet declaration that this sidewalk, this neighborhood, this country he'd bled for, they belonged to him too. The Medal of Honor in his dresser drawer meant nothing to them. The Purple Heart, the Bronze Star, the 40 years of service, invisible to eyes that saw only skin color and the assumption of guilt. But Sergeant knew. Sergeant remembered the mountains of Afghanistan, the IED that nearly killed them both, the months of recovery where they'd learned to trust again. Tonight, as the cruiser's headlights flicked on in the gathering dusk, Marcus felt something shift in the air. Not fear. He'd left fear bleeding in foreign sand, but recognition. He'd been hunted before by men with better training and deadlier intent. He'd survived then, and he'd survived now. But as Sergeant's muscles tensed beneath his coat, as the cruiser began its slow, predatory crawl behind them, Marcus Washington knew the war had followed him home. Officer Daniel Brooks adjusted his rearview mirror for the third time in 5 minutes, his jaw working like he was chewing nails. 42 years old, 20 years on the force, and he'd never gotten used to the way some people looked at him, like they expected better. Like they thought the badge meant something more than authority and the power to use it. "There he goes again," Brooks muttered, watching Marcus Washington's measured stride through the windshield. "Same time, same route, military precision. You don't just walk like that unless you're planning something." Officer Kevin Walsh cracked his knuckles, the sound sharp in the confined space of the patrol car. At 35, Walsh had the kind of restless energy that came from too many years of traffic stops and domestic disputes, too many nights going home feeling like he hadn't made a difference. Big dog like that, trained for combat, man his age shouldn't be handling that kind of weapon. In the back seat, Officer Tony Martinez, 26, and still believing the Academy's promises about protecting and serving, shifted uncomfortably. "Weapon? It's just a dog, guys, and the man's a veteran. I looked him up. Colonel Marcus Washington, Medal of Honor recipient, Purple Heart, Bronze Star, 4 decades of service." Brooks's laugh was bitter. "That was then, Martinez. This is now. You see how he walks? Like he owns the whole damn neighborhood. Like he's better than the people who've lived here their whole lives." Walsh nodded, his fingers drumming against his thigh. "Intimidation tactic. Walking through a family neighborhood with a military attack dog, showing off, making people nervous in their own homes." "He's just walking his dog," Martinez said quietly, but his voice lacked conviction. He'd been partnered with Brooks and Walsh for 3 months now, long enough to learn that questioning their judgment wasn't career smart. Long enough to start doubting his own instincts. The truth was simpler and uglier than any of them wanted to admit. Riverside had been changing, slowly, quietly, but changing nonetheless. The tech boom had brought new money, new faces, new families who didn't look like the ones who'd built the community 50 years ago. And Marcus Washington, with his military bearing and unshakable dignity, represented everything Brooks feared about that change. The possibility that respect wasn't automatically his, that authority had to be earned, that the world was moving on without asking his permission. 3 weeks we've been monitoring this situation," Brooks said, starting the engine. 3 weeks of complaints from concerned residents about feeling threatened, about aggressive behavior from that animal. Martinez frowned. "What complaints? I haven't seen any reports filed." Walsh turned in his seat, eyes hard. "Not everything goes through official channels, rookie. Sometimes community policing means listening to what people don't feel safe saying out loud." The cruiser began its slow roll down Magnolia Street, staying exactly 50 yards behind Marcus and Sargent. Brooks had calculated the distance, close enough to be noticed, far enough to avoid accusations of harassment. It was a game he'd perfected over the years, the art of making someone feel watched without crossing legal lines. "Look at that posture," Walsh observed, leaning forward. "Military training never leaves a man. He's assessing threats, checking corners, maintaining situational awareness. That's not the behavior of someone out for a peaceful walk." Martinez watched Marcus's steady pace, the way Sargent moved in perfect synchronization beside him, and felt something cold settle in his stomach. His grandfather had walked the same way, proud, unbroken, carrying invisible wounds from wars that never really ended. But he kept quiet, trapped between conscience and career, between right and belonging. Brooks's radio crackled to life. Dispatch reported a minor fender bender across town, but he didn't respond. Tonight, they had more important work to do. Tonight, they were going to make it clear that some people needed to remember their place, needed to understand that dignity was a privilege, not a right. The sun sank lower, painting the suburban streets in shades of copper and shadow. And in the growing darkness, 3 men in uniform convinced themselves they were protecting a community from a threat that existed only in their fears, their prejudices, their desperate need to feel powerful in a world that was slowly, inexorably leaving them behind. 16-year-old Jake Morrison balanced precariously on the edge of his bedroom window, drone controller steady in his hands as he guided the small aircraft through the amber twilight. The DJI Mini had been his birthday gift, a compromise from parents who'd grown tired of his pestering about film school and figured 40 minutes of flight time might keep him occupied and out of trouble. Jake wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for beauty. The way California light painted suburban rooftops gold, how shadows stretched like fingers across manicured lawns, the poetry of ordinary moments captured from impossible angles. His Instagram followers loved the aerial shots, and college applications were due in 6 months. Every frame needed to count. From his second-story perch, Jake could see most of the neighborhood spread out like a board game. The Hendersons' pool reflected sky like a mirror. Mrs. Chen's garden bloomed in perfect geometric patterns. And there, moving with military precision down Magnolia Street, walked the old man with the incredible dog. Jake had noticed them before. Hard not to, really. Colonel Washington carried himself like he was still in uniform, and that German shepherd moved like liquid steel. Jake's father, a weekend warrior who'd done one tour in Iraq, had pointed them out months ago. "That's a real soldier, son. See how he walks? That's what service looks like." The drone's camera was already rolling when Jake spotted the patrol car. At first he thought nothing of it. Cops were part of the neighborhood landscape, as common as mailboxes and stop signs. But something about the way the cruiser moved caught his attention. Too slow, too deliberate, too much like a predator stalking prey. Jake adjusted the drone's altitude, zooming in slightly. Through the high-definition feed, he could see 3 officers inside the vehicle, their body language tense with purpose. The car maintained perfect distance behind Colonel Washington, close enough to intimidate but far enough to claim innocence. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, his finger hovering over the record button. His father had taught him to recognize tactical formations, and what he was watching looked less like patrol and more like surveillance. The kind of surveillance that ended badly for someone. The drone's battery indicator showed 32 minutes remaining. Jake made a decision that would change everything. He began following the patrol car that was following the old man, his camera capturing every moment of what was unfolding below. Colonel Washington never looked back, never acknowledged the cruiser's presence, but Jake could see the way his shoulders set, the slight adjustment in his pace. Sergeant's ears were up, alert, scanning for threats with military precision. They knew they were being hunted, but they weren't running. Jake's phone buzzed, a text from his girlfriend asking about weekend plans, but he ignored it. Something was building in the streets below, something that felt important in a way he couldn't articulate. The golden hour light was perfect for filming, but the subject matter was growing darker by the minute. The patrol car's windows were tinted, but Jake's drone camera was good enough to catch glimpses of movement inside. The driver's hands were tight on the wheel. The passenger was leaning forward, engaged, predatory. The officer in the back seat looked younger, uncertain, like he wasn't sure he wanted to be part of whatever was coming. As the small convoy moved deeper into the residential area, away from main streets and potential witnesses, Jake felt his pulse quicken. His finger found the emergency recording function, the feature that would automatically save and back up footage to the cloud in real time. Something told him this wasn't just neighborhood patrol. This was a setup. The drone hummed quietly above the unfolding drama, its lens capturing truth in 4K resolution, its teenage operator suddenly understanding that he wasn't just filming a school project anymore. He was documenting history. He was becoming a witness to whatever line was about to be crossed. Jake's hands steadied on the controller, his filmmaker's instincts taken over. Keep the shot stable, maintain distance, don't lose focus, and above all, don't stop recording. because something told him the world was going to need to see this. The morning after the third patrol encounter, Marcus Washington stood in his kitchen, staring at the jagged hole where his window used to be. Glass littered the floor like frozen tears, and in the center of the destruction lay a brick wrapped in newspaper. The headline was visible: "Neighborhood Watch Concerns Grow." But it wasn't the broken window that made his hands tremble as he swept up the shards. It was the silence that followed, the way Mrs. Patterson next door suddenly found urgent business inside her house whenever he appeared in his yard, the way conversation stopped when he entered the grocery store, the way his own neighbors had begun looking at him like he was the problem. Sargent sat at attention near the back door, ears rotating like radar dishes, processing threats Marcus couldn't yet see. The dog hadn't relaxed in days, sleeping light, positioning himself between Marcus and any potential danger. 40 years of military training had taught Marcus to trust his dog's instincts, and right now those instincts were screaming warnings. The phone rang. Marcus almost ignored it. Too many calls lately had been heavy breathing or muttered threats, but the caller ID showed a number he recognized. Deputy Lisa Chang, one of the few officers in the department who still remembered what the badge was supposed to represent. "Colonel Washington?" Her voice was tight, professional. "We need to talk. Off the record." "About what, Deputy?" "About the fact that you're being systematically harassed, and about the fact that I can't find a single official report documenting any complaints against you. Someone's running an unauthorized operation, and they're using department resources to do it." Marcus sat down heavily at his kitchen table, suddenly feeling all of his 72 years. "How long have you known?" "I've suspected for weeks. Confirmed it yesterday when I ran the patrol schedules. Brooks, Walsh, and Martinez have been logging overtime for community safety initiatives that don't exist in any official capacity. They're stalking you, Colonel, and they're doing it on the taxpayer's dime." Through his remaining window, Marcus watched a black sedan cruise slowly past his house. Not the usual patrol car, but the message was the same. "We're watching. We're waiting. We're coming." "There's something else," Deputy Chang continued. "I did some digging into your background. Medal of Honor, Afghanistan, 2009. You saved 37 soldiers when your convoy was ambushed. You took shrapnel in your leg and kept fighting until the rescue choppers arrived." "Ancient history," Marcus said quietly. "Not to me. Not to anyone who understands what service means. But, Colonel, I need you to know this isn't going to stop. Men like Brooks don't back down when they think they've found a target. They escalate until something breaks." Marcus looked at Sargent, who was now standing at the window, body tense as a coiled spring. "What are you suggesting, Deputy?" "I'm suggesting you be very careful, and I'm suggesting that when they finally make their move, because they will make their move, you make sure there are witnesses." After she hung up, Marcus walked to his bedroom dresser and opened the top drawer. Beneath folded undershirts and old photographs lay a small wooden box. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, rested the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. He'd earned it by refusing to abandon his men when every instinct screamed at him to run. He'd earned it by standing firm when the world exploded around him, by making himself a target so others could find safety. The citation read like something from a movie. His extraordinary heroism and selfless devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of military service. Marcus closed the box gently, his fingers lingering on the worn wood. 40 years later, he was being asked to be a hero again, not on a foreign battlefield, but on American streets, not against enemy combatants, but against the very system he'd sworn to protect. That evening, as he prepared for his walk, Marcus made a decision. He pinned the Medal of Honor to his jacket, not as a shield, but as a statement. If they wanted to intimidate a decorated war hero, they'd have to do it while looking at the symbol of everything they claimed to represent. Sargent seemed to sense the change, his posture shifting from protective to tactical. They weren't just going for a walk anymore. They were going to war. And this time, Marcus Washington wasn't planning to retreat. The call came at 11:47 p.m., jarring Marcus Washington from restless sleep. Sargent was instantly alert, positioning himself between the bedroom door and his master, hackles raised at the unfamiliar late-night intrusion. Marcus reached for the phone with hands that no longer shook, not since he'd made the decision to stop running from what was coming. "Colonel Washington." The voice was young, nervous, barely above a whisper. "This is Officer Martinez. Tony Martinez, I need to talk to you." Marcus sat up slowly, instantly awake. "Officer Martinez, calling rather late, aren't you?" "I can't sleep, sir. Haven't been able to for days. What we're doing, what they're planning, it's not right. It's not what I signed up for when I took this badge." "What exactly are you telling me, officer?" There was a long pause, filled with the sound of labored breathing and what might have been traffic in the background. "Brooks and Walsh, they're not just watching you anymore. They've been building a case, a fake case, fabricating reports, documenting aggressive behavior that never happened. They're setting you up, Colonel." The room suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin. Marcus had survived ambushes, IED explosions, and 40 years of military operations, but this felt different. This was betrayal wrapped in the flag he'd bled for. "Why are you telling me this?" Marcus asked. "Because you're a Medal of Honor recipient, sir. Because my grandfather fought in Vietnam and he taught me what honor means. Because I can't watch this happen and still call myself a police officer." Marcus closed his eyes, feeling the weight of decades pressing down on his shoulders. "What are they planning, son?" "Tomorrow night, they're going to corner you during your walk, claim you were threatening residents that your dog attacked. They've already written the reports, sir, already decided how it ends." The line went quiet except for the sound of two men breathing. One young officer wrestling with his conscience, one old soldier preparing for his final battle. "There's something else," Martinez continued. "Brooks has been in contact with someone higher up. This isn't just about harassment anymore. Someone wants you gone, Colonel. Really gone." Marcus felt Sargent press against his leg, solid and warm and utterly loyal. "Officer Martinez, are you prepared to testify to what you've just told me?" I don't know, sir. I've got a wife, a baby on the way. If I go against Brooks and Walsh..." "I understand, son. I understand better than you might think." After Martinez hung up, Marcus sat in the darkness for a long time, his hand resting on Sargent's head. Outside, a car drove slowly past his house, too slowly for innocent passage, too quietly for coincidence. They weren't hiding anymore. The pretense of patrol was over. He walked to his dresser and retrieved the Medal of Honor, holding it up to catch the streetlight filtering through his curtains. The bronze star seemed to pulse with its own light, heavy with the weight of sacrifice and the promise of duty. He'd been awarded this medal for refusing to abandon his men in the face of overwhelming odds. Tomorrow night, he'd find out if he still had that same courage. His phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Last chance to leave quietly, old man." Marcus typed back slowly, his fingers steady. "I didn't survive Afghanistan to be intimidated by cowards hiding behind badges. See you tomorrow." He set the phone aside and looked at Sargent, whose intelligent eyes seemed to understand everything. "One more mission, boy. One more time into the breach." The dog's tail thumped once against the floor, not excitement, but acknowledgement. They were soldiers again, facing an enemy that wore familiar uniforms and spoke their language, but had forgotten what service truly meant. Marcus Washington had spent 40 years protecting America from foreign threats. Tomorrow night, he'd discover if America was worth protecting from itself. The house settled into silence, but neither man nor dog slept. Outside, engines idled and radios crackled with coded messages. The trap was being set, the stage prepared for a confrontation that would test everything Marcus had ever believed about justice, honor, and the country he'd served with distinction. But they'd made one critical mistake. They thought they were hunting a helpless old man. Instead, they'd cornered a decorated war hero who'd never learned how to surrender. The evening air hung thick and still as Marcus Washington clipped Sergeant's leash with hands that hadn't trembled since Kandahar. The Medal of Honor caught the dying light, pinned prominently to his dark jacket like a challenge issued to the universe. At 72, he moved with the deliberate precision of a man who'd learned that every step might be his last, every breath a gift not to be wasted. Sergeant's ears were already up, rotating like radar dishes, processing threats and calculating distances with military precision. The dog had been restless all day, pacing near windows, positioning himself between Marcus and potential danger. 40 years of partnership between soldier and working dog had taught them to trust instincts over hope. They stepped into the street just as the sun kissed the horizon, painting Riverside's suburban perfection in shades of copper and blood. The evening joggers were out, the lawn sprinklers whispered their mechanical prayers, and somewhere in the distance, children laughed in backyards that felt increasingly like fortresses. Marcus chose the quieter route tonight, not from fear, but from tactics. The path behind Riverside Park curved through oak trees and forgotten corners, away from streetlights and casual witnesses. If they wanted confrontation, he'd give them the privacy they needed to reveal their true nature. The first cruiser appeared at the bend near the old memorial statue, headlights off, engine purring like a mechanical predator. Officer Daniel Brooks sat behind the wheel, his jaw set in grim satisfaction. This was the moment he had been planning for weeks, the moment he'd finally prove that respect was something you took, not earned. Officer Kevin Walsh emerged from the passenger side, baton already in hand, his movements sharp with anticipation. Behind them, Officer Tony Martinez stepped out reluctantly, his face pale in the gathering darkness. The young officer's eyes met Marcus's for a brief moment, and in that glance was an apology he couldn't voice. "Evening, Colonel," Brooks called out, his voice dripping with false civility. "Beautiful night for a walk, isn't it?" Marcus didn't respond immediately. He'd learned in Afghanistan that silence was often the strongest weapon, that letting enemies talk first revealed their intentions and their weaknesses. Sergeant pressed against his leg, body tense but controlled, waiting for the command that would never come unless absolutely necessary. Walsh began circling them slowly, like a shark testing the waters. "Big dog you got there, old man. Looks dangerous. Looks like the kind of animal that might attack without warning." "He's leashed," Marcus replied calmly, "as required by law." Brooks stepped closer, his hand resting casually on his holster. "Leash doesn't mean much if the handler can't control the animal. Man your age, with a military-trained attack dog, makes people nervous." The words hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Marcus recognized the setup, the careful language designed to create justification, the positioning that blocked escape routes, the escalating rhetoric that would make whatever came next seem inevitable. "I've been walking these streets for 3 years, Marcus said, his voice steady as carved stone. "Never had a problem until you decided to make one." Walsh's laugh was sharp and ugly. "Problem? We're trying to keep the community safe. Can't have dangerous animals threatening families." That's when Brooks made his move, reaching not for his radio or his handcuffs, but directly for his service weapon. The motion was quick, practiced, designed to look reactive rather than predatory. "Sir, I need you to control that animal," but he'd made a critical error. He'd forgotten that the man he was threatening had survived more firefights than he'd worked traffic stops, had faced down enemies with better training and deadlier intent. Marcus Washington had earned his Medal of Honor by refusing to break under pressure, and Brooks was about to learn what that really meant. "Sergeant," Marcus said quietly, "guard." The transformation was instant and terrifying. Sergeant didn't lunge or attack. He positioned himself as a living shield, his body language shifting from pet to weapon, his growl rumbling up from depths that spoke of war zones and survival. This wasn't aggression. This was military precision applied to civilian threat assessment. Above them, unnoticed by the officers, a drone hummed quietly in the darkening sky, its camera capturing every moment, every word, every casual reach for a weapon against an unarmed civilian. Jake Morrison gripped his controller with white knuckles, his teenage heart hammering as he realized he was witnessing something that would change everything. Brooks hesitated, his hand still on his gun, suddenly aware that the narrative he'd constructed was crumbling. The old man wasn't cowering, wasn't giving him the reaction he needed to justify what came next. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of 4 decades in uniform. "A mistake that's being recorded." For the first time, Brooks looked up. Jake Morrison's hands trembled as he guided the drone back to his bedroom window, his mind racing faster than his heart. The footage was already uploaded to the cloud. 23 minutes of raw, unfiltered truth that would burn through social media like wildfire through dry brush. What he'd captured wasn't just police harassment. It was attempted murder wrapped in a badge. The video began trending within an hour of upload. Jake had titled it simply, "Decorated War Hero Threatened by Police, Full Footage," and let the truth speak for itself. No commentary, no music, no editing, just the unblinking eye of digital witness recording what happened when power met principle in suburban America. By midnight, the video had 50,000 views. By dawn, it was approaching 500,000. Cable news producers were already calling Jake's parents, their phones ringing with the desperate hunger of a media machine that smelled blood in the water. This wasn't just local news anymore. This was national scandal. The footage was devastating in its clarity. Marcus Washington, 72 years old, Medal of Honor recipient, standing calm and dignified while 3 armed officers surrounded him like wolves. Officer Brooks's hand on his weapon was visible in high definition. The dog's military precision was obvious to anyone who'd ever seen professional training. And through it all, Marcus's voice, steady, unbroken, refusing to be intimidated. The comments section exploded with rage and recognition. Veterans shared their own stories of coming home to find the country they'd served no longer recognized their sacrifice. Black Americans pointed out the familiar pattern, the way authority always found reasons to see threat in dignity, danger in presence, aggression in self-respect. But it was the moment when Marcus said "guard" that really set social media ablaze. Military working dog handlers recognized Sergeant's response immediately. Not an attack, but protection, the kind of disciplined defense that saved lives in war zones. This wasn't a pet protecting its owner. This was a soldier protecting his commanding officer. CNN picked up the story by 6 a.m. Fox News ran it an hour later. By noon, Marcus Washington's name was trending nationwide, and by evening, his story had spread beyond America to global audiences who watched in horrified fascination as the country that called itself the land of the free revealed its true face. The Riverside Police Department's phone lines jammed with calls demanding answers. Mayor Patricia Chen found herself facing the worst crisis of her political career, fielding questions from reporters who'd descended on the quiet suburb like locusts. The 3 officers were placed on administrative leave pending investigation, but everyone knew that wouldn't be enough. Marcus himself didn't watch the video. He didn't need to. He'd lived it. but he felt its impact in every corner of his routine. Strangers stopped him on the street to shake his hand, to thank him for his service, to apologize for their silence. The grocery store manager, who'd once eyed him suspiciously, now personally walked him to his car. Mrs. Patterson next door brought him homemade pie and tears of shame. The donations started small, a few dollars here and there from people who wanted to help with his legal expenses. But as the story spread, the amounts grew. Veterans organizations rallied to his cause. Civil rights groups offered legal representation. By the end of the week, Marcus Washington had become not just a symbol of resistance, but a focal point for every American who'd ever felt powerless in the face of institutional abuse. The most powerful response came from an unexpected source: the White House. Press Secretary Jennifer Martinez read a statement that afternoon that sent shockwaves through law enforcement communities nationwide. The president has been briefed on the situation in Riverside, California. Any threat against a Medal of Honor recipient, or any American citizen, by those sworn to protect and serve, represents a fundamental betrayal of our values and our Constitution. But perhaps the most telling reaction came from Jake Morrison himself. The teenager who'd accidentally become a whistleblower sat in his bedroom, watching view counts climb toward 7 figures, and realized he'd just learned the most important lesson of his young life. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to look away. The video was more than viral now. It was a reckoning. And Marcus Washington, who'd spent 40 years serving a country that had never fully accepted him, found himself at the center of a conversation America had been avoiding for centuries. The question was no longer what would happen next. The question was whether justice would finally arrive, or whether even viral truth could be buried under the weight of institutional denial. The federal courthouse in downtown Los Angeles stood like a monument to marble cold justice, its columns rising toward a sky that seemed to hold its breath. Marcus Washington sat in the witness chair, his back straight as rifle steel, the Medal of Honor gleaming against his navy suit jacket like a bronze accusation aimed at the heart of American hypocrisy. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with overflow crowds watching on screens in adjacent rooms and millions more following live streams across social media platforms. This wasn't just a trial, it was a national examination of conscience, a moment when the country had to look in the mirror and decide what it really believed about honor, service, and the meaning of citizenship. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen approached the witness stand with the measured steps of someone carrying the weight of history. The charges were serious: civil rights violations, conspiracy, attempted assault under color of authority. But everyone in the room knew the real question being litigated was simpler and more fundamental: whether America would protect those who had protected it. Colonel Washington, Prosecutor Chen began, her voice clear and respectful, "Please tell the court about your military service." Marcus's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd earned every word. 40 years active duty, United States Army. Multiple deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan. Commanding officer, 3rd Infantry Division. Awarded the Medal of Honor for actions in Kandahar Province, 2009. Can you describe the circumstances that led to that medal? The courtroom fell into cathedral silence. Marcus's eyes found a point somewhere beyond the packed gallery, seeing not the faces of strangers, but the mountains of Afghanistan, the smoke and blood and impossible choices that defined heroism. My convoy was ambushed. IED took out the lead vehicle, small arms fire from 3 positions. 37 soldiers under my command, half of them wounded, all of them trapped. His voice never wavered, but those who knew how to listen could hear the ghosts in every syllable. I could have called for extraction, could have withdrawn to safety. Instead, I moved forward, drew enemy fire away from my men while establishing a defensive perimeter. Took shrapnel in my leg, kept fighting until rescue arrived. Nobody died on my watch that day." The words hung in the air like incense, sacred and heavy with sacrifice. Several jurors wiped their eyes. In the gallery, veterans stood spontaneously, a silent salute that spoke louder than applause. Defense attorney Michael Brennan rose for cross-examination, his face grim with the knowledge that he was about to attack an American hero in front of a national audience. His strategy was predictable: make Marcus seem paranoid, aggressive, unstable. Paint the incident as a misunderstanding between nervous officers and an intimidating civilian. "Colonel Washington, isn't it true that you deliberately chose a confrontational route that evening, that you wore your Medal of Honor as a form of provocation?" Marcus's response was diamond-hard and laser-focused. "Counselor, I earned the right to walk American streets without fear. I earned the right to wear the decorations my country gave me for bleeding in its service. If you find that provocative, the problem isn't with me." The defense attorney tried again. "Your dog was trained for military combat. Isn't it reasonable that officers might perceive such an animal as a threat?" "Sergeant was trained to protect American soldiers from enemy combatants," Marcus replied, his voice carrying the edge of contained fury. "He's never failed to distinguish between friend and foe. The question you should be asking is why 3 armed officers felt threatened by one unarmed 72-year-old veteran walking his dog on a public sidewalk in the country he served." When the prosecution played the drone footage again, the courtroom watched in stunned silence as the truth unfolded in high definition. Officer Brooks's hand on his weapon was unmistakable. The deliberate encirclement was clear. Marcus's calm dignity in the face of armed intimidation was devastating to witness, but it was the moment when Sergeant responded to the guard command that really drove the point home. Military experts had analyzed the footage frame by frame. This wasn't an attack dog going wild, but a trained professional responding to a legitimate threat with precisely calibrated force. The dog had positioned himself as a shield, not a weapon. The defense's case crumbled like sand in a hurricane. Character witnesses spoke of Marcus's decades of community service, his mentorship of young veterans, his quiet generosity to neighbors who were only now beginning to understand the man they'd failed to protect. Medal of Honor recipients from other conflicts testified about the meaning of that decoration, the impossible standard of heroism it represented. When Deputy Lisa Chang took the stand, her testimony was devastating. The officers had no official authorization for their surveillance. No complaints had been filed. They were conducting personal harassment using department resources, targeting Colonel Washington for no reason other than his presence in their preferred narrative of who belonged in that neighborhood. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. When they returned, the foreman, himself a Vietnam veteran, stood with tears in his eyes. "We find the defendants guilty on all counts." The courtroom erupted, but Marcus Washington simply sat quietly, his hand resting on the witness stand rail, his face showing not triumph but exhaustion. Justice had been served, but the cost, to him, to his community, to his faith in the country he'd served, would take much longer to calculate. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions, but Marcus had only one statement. "This was never about me. This was about whether America keeps its promises to those who keep faith with America. Today, for once, it did." The silence in the federal courtroom stretched like a held breath as Judge Patricia Nakamura prepared to deliver sentences that would echo far beyond the marble walls of justice. The defendants, former officers Daniel Brooks, Kevin Walsh, and Tony Martinez, sat at the defense table with the hollow-eyed stare of men watching their careers, their reputations, and their freedom crumble in real time. Marcus Washington sat in the front row, Sergeant at his feet, the first time the dog had been allowed in the courtroom, a small victory that felt enormous in its symbolism. The Medal of Honor caught the fluorescent light, no longer just a decoration but a shield that had finally done its job. Judge Nakamura's voice carried the weight of precedent and the promise of change. In 40 years on this bench, I have never seen a case that so clearly illustrated the corruption of power and the courage required to stand against it. The defendants used their badges not to protect and serve, but to intimidate and threaten a decorated war hero whose only crime was existing with dignity in his own neighborhood. Brooks stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched like a fist. The man who'd spent weeks planning Marcus's humiliation now faced federal prison time, the loss of his pension, and the permanent disgrace that comes with betraying everything a badge is supposed to represent. Daniel Brooks, the judge continued, as the ringleader of this conspiracy, you will serve 18 months in federal prison followed by 2 years supervised probation. You are permanently barred from law enforcement and will pay restitution in the amount of $50,000 to Colonel Washington. Walsh's sentence was identical: 18 months, probation, disgrace. But it was Martinez's hearing that provided the day's most emotional moment. The young officer who'd called Marcus in the middle of the night to warn him stood with tears in his eyes as his attorney argued for leniency based on his cooperation and obvious remorse. "Officer Martinez," Judge Nakamura said, her voice softer but no less firm, "your cooperation with this investigation likely prevented a tragedy. However, your silence during the initial harassment makes you complicit in this conspiracy. 6 months in federal prison, 2 years probation, and permanent removal from law enforcement. Use this time to remember why you became a police officer in the first place." The courtroom stirred as the sentences were announced, but Marcus remained motionless, his face betraying no satisfaction or vindication. This wasn't about revenge. It had never been about revenge. This was about establishing the principle that courage should be protected, not punished, and that service to country meant something more than empty words at political rallies. Federal prosecutor Sarah Chen stood for her closing statement. Today's sentences send a clear message. The Constitution applies to everyone, including, and especially, those who wear badges. Colonel Washington's courage in standing firm against intimidation has reminded us all that democracy requires ordinary citizens to do extraordinary things when faced with the abuse of power. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus was asked if he wanted to address the court. He stood slowly, his 72 years evident in the careful way he rose, but his voice carried the strength of 4 decades in uniform. "Your Honor, I didn't serve 40 years in the United States Army to come home and be afraid of the people sworn to protect the community I'd bled to defend. These officers forgot that the badge is a symbol of service, not superiority. The uniform represents obligation, not authority over those we're meant to serve." He paused, his eyes finding each of the defendants in turn. "I forgive them, because holding hatred corrodes the soul, and I've carried enough weight in my life. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it doesn't mean accepting that this behavior is acceptable. What happened to me happens to too many Americans who don't have cameras watching, who don't have viral videos to protect them, who don't have medals on their chests to remind the world of their worth." His voice grew stronger, filling the courtroom with the authority of earned wisdom. "Every person walking American streets deserves the same dignity I was forced to fight for. Every citizen should be able to exist without justifying their presence to those who've forgotten that power comes with responsibility." Marcus sat down to thunderous applause that Judge Nakamura allowed to continue for a full minute before calling for order. The sound wasn't just approval, it was recognition, acknowledgement of a truth that had been spoken in a place where truth too often died in legal technicalities and procedural delays. Outside the courthouse, the scene was electric with vindication and hope. Veterans organizations had organized an honor guard, dozens of men and women in uniform standing in silent tribute as Marcus emerged. News crews from every major network broadcast live coverage, But the most powerful images came from ordinary citizens, the neighbors who'd finally found their voices, the teenagers who'd learned what courage looked like, the elderly who remembered when standing up meant something more than posting on social media. Deputy Lisa Chang, who'd risked her career to speak truth, approached Marcus with tears in her eyes. "Colonel, thank you for showing us what integrity looks like. The department is instituting new protocols, mandatory training on civil rights, accountability measures that should have existed decades ago." Marcus nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Changes on paper mean nothing if hearts don't change too, Deputy. This was never about 3 bad officers. This was about a system that protected them until cameras forced accountability." Jake Morrison, the teenager whose drone footage had started it all, pushed through the crowd with his parents flanking him like protective shields. At 16, he'd accidentally become a hero, but the weight of that responsibility was evident in his eyes. "Colonel Washington," Jake said, his voice cracking with emotion, "I just want you to know I'll never stop watching. I'll never stop recording. They won't be able to do this to anyone else, not while people like me are paying attention." Marcus placed a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder. "Son, you didn't just save me that night. You saved the idea that truth matters, that witnesses matter, that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they refuse to look away." As the crowd began to disperse, Marcus and Sargent walked slowly toward his car, the weight of months of stress finally beginning to lift from his shoulders. The Medal of Honor caught the late afternoon sun, no longer a target for those who mistook service for threat, but a reminder that some things, honor, dignity, courage, could never be legislated away or intimidated into silence. The verdict was more than guilty. It was a declaration that America, at its best, still protected those who'd protected it, still honored those who'd earned honor, still believed that justice was more than just a word carved in courthouse stone. But Marcus Washington knew the real test wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the streets, in the daily interactions between power and vulnerability, in the millions of moments when ordinary Americans would have to choose between comfort and courage. The battle was won. The war for America's soul continued. 6 months after the verdict that shook Riverside to its foundation, Marcus Washington stood at the edge of the same trail where his world had nearly ended, where 3 men in uniform had tried to erase him from the American story he'd helped write with 4 decades of service and sacrifice. The morning sun painted the suburban landscape in shades of gold and possibility, and for the first time in years, Marcus felt something approaching peace. Sargent stood beside him, no longer hypervigilant but calm, alert, the difference between a soldier in a war zone and a guardian in a place finally worthy of protection. The dog's gray muzzle showed his age, but his eyes remained sharp with intelligence and unshakable loyalty. They'd both survived battles they never should have had to fight. The trail itself had changed. A small bronze plaque had been installed near the oak tree where the confrontation occurred, its inscription simple but powerful: "In honor of all who serve with courage and stand with dignity, Riverside Veterans Memorial Path." Marcus hadn't asked for the memorial, but he understood its importance. Sometimes symbols mattered more than the people they honored. His morning walk now drew a different kind of attention. Children waved from school bus windows. Joggers nodded respectfully. Mrs. Patterson had returned to her old routine of garden gate conversations, their friendship rebuilt on the foundation of shared shame and mutual forgiveness. The silence that had once surrounded him like a shroud had been replaced by the comfortable noise of community recognition. The broader impact rippled far beyond Riverside's manicured streets. The Washington Protocol had been adopted by police departments nationwide: mandatory body cameras, bias training, civilian oversight committees. Officer Tony Martinez, after serving his sentence, had become an advocate for police reform, speaking at academies about the cost of silence and the courage required to choose conscience over career. 3 new families had moved into the neighborhood, drawn by the story of a place that had confronted its demons and emerged stronger. The Johnsons, a young black couple with 2 children, had specifically chosen Riverside because they'd heard it was a community that protected dignity. Marcus had welcomed them personally, sharing coffee and stories about the kind of America worth fighting for. Jake Morrison was now a freshman at USC Film School, his scholarship funded partially by the viral success of his documentary about the incident. He'd learned that bearing witness was a responsibility, not just a hobby, and his current project focused on veterans' stories, the gap between the heroes America celebrated and the citizens it sometimes failed to protect. The legal victory had brought financial compensation, but Marcus had donated most of it to organizations supporting veterans' rights and police accountability. He kept only enough to establish a small scholarship fund for young people interested in journalism, understanding that democracy's survival depended on citizens willing to point cameras at uncomfortable truths. Deputy Lisa Chang had been promoted to detective and assigned to the department's new Community Relations Division. Her first initiative was a program pairing retired veterans with active officers, building bridges between those who'd served abroad and those who served at home. The program was already showing results: fewer complaints, better relationships, a police force that remembered its role as protectors rather than occupiers. As Marcus began his walk, he passed the spot where the patrol car had first appeared, where 3 men had made the mistake of assuming that dignity was weakness, that age was vulnerability, that service was ancient history. The asphalt looked the same, but the meaning had changed. This wasn't where he'd been hunted. This was where he'd stood firm. His phone buzzed with a text message from his nephew in Atlanta. "Saw your interview on CNN. Proud of you, Uncle Marcus. Kids at school are doing reports about you for Black History Month." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd become history while still living it, a symbol of resistance while simply trying to exist with quiet dignity. The trail curved toward the park where children played on swings and slides that had once seemed like props in a suburban theater of denial. Now they looked like what they were supposed to be: promises of a future where kids could grow up believing in justice, where service was honored, where standing up to bullies wasn't heroic but expected. A young girl, maybe 8 years old, broke away from her mother's supervision and ran toward Marcus with the fearless curiosity that defined childhood. "Are you the metal man?" she asked breathlessly. "The one who stood up to the mean policeman?" Marcus knelt slowly, bringing himself to her eye level. "I'm just someone who remembered that America is worth defending, even from Americans who forget what it means." She nodded solemnly, processing wisdom beyond her years, then surprised him with a snapped salute that would have made any drill sergeant proud. "Thank you for your service," she said, the words carrying more weight than most adults could manage. As Marcus completed his circuit, returning to the point where his journey toward justice had begun, he felt the weight of Naomi's absence less acutely than before. His late wife's memory lived in the dog tags that still hung around his neck, in the courage she'd taught him to maintain, in the love that had sustained him through decades of service and months of threat. Sergeant nudged his hand, ready to head home to breakfast in the morning news shows that still occasionally featured their story. The dog understood that their mission had changed, no longer about survival, but about setting an example, proving that dignity defended was dignity preserved for everyone who came after. Marcus Washington had spent 40 years defending America from foreign enemies. In the end, his greatest victory had come from defending America from itself, from the forces of intimidation and ignorance that tried to shrink the definition of citizenship to exclude those who'd earned it with blood and sacrifice. He walked home with his head high, his dog at his side, his Medal of Honor catching the morning light like a beacon for anyone still learning what courage looked like. The battle was over, but the example remained, written in courthouse records, preserved in viral video, lived out in the daily choice to exist with unshakable dignity in a country still learning to live up to its promises. Behind him, the memorial trail stretched toward a horizon bright with possibility, a path where other Americans could walk without fear, where service was honored, where standing up to injustice wasn't extraordinary but ordinary. The simple, powerful act of refusing to be erased from the story of a nation still struggling to become worthy of its heroes. This story reminds us that dignity is not granted but chosen, that service to country means more than wearing a uniform, and that sometimes the greatest battles are fought not on foreign fields but on American streets. Marcus Washington's courage in the face of institutional intimidation proves that heroes aren't just made in war zones. They're revealed whenever ordinary people refuse to accept injustice as normal. Thanks for watching. If this story moved you, give it a like and comment "honor" if you believe service should be respected regardless of age or circumstance. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories of courage, dignity, and the ongoing fight for justice in America.